All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm going to run through a couple really quick housekeeping items, and then I'm actually going to go ahead and do, kind of a quick introduction of who I am, what we do here at Reviewer, before we're kind of getting deeper into, the agenda for today and kind of the topic that we want to run through. Because I think, setting the stage a little bit of how we got to this point actually does help quite a bit and kind of helps tell the whole story. So, couple quick housekeeping items here today. Did wake up with a little bit of a cold, so if I'm a little bit nasally, if you can't hear me, unfortunately, it's not a whole lot that I can do about that. So just kind of bear with me. Number two is there is a built-in chat section in Zoom. I'm sure we're all aware by now. I love to make these webinars and kind of these tours as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or insights or feedback, if you want to offer, insights and feedback into things that you're up to, please do toss them in the chat. We'll kind of address them and we'll kind of run with it as we go. If not, we'll kind of save it for the end for some Q&A. So I will keep that open and I'll kind of monitor it as we go. So with all that said, let's go ahead and kind of get running into today's topic. And ultimately, I think the main goal today is to kind of talk through, the main benefits and insights around running recognition awards for your membership. Now, a lot of the components and things that we may talk about today actually relate very well to scholarship programs, board nominations, leadership development programs at the chamber, things like that. But the main goal is to A, talk a little bit about, the benefits and how to run recognition awards for your audience. And then number two, kind of in practicality, previewing what one of our chambers works with, the Austin A-list, the Austin Chamber, and how they're running it so that we can kind of visualize it. So how do we even get to this point? So ultimately, kind of a really quick high-level introduction. Been doing this since 2012. My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewer. We actually built Reviewer from our own firsthand experience serving as a volunteer, right? So, volunteering both within our local chambers as well as for local nonprofits and membership-based associations. And so, we served on the volunteer review committees for obviously recognition programs, scholarships, grants, board nominations, you name it. And so, back in 2012, as you can imagine, maybe still to this day, many of these programs are done quite manual. So, physical mailed in binders, right, for nomination packets. We were tasked with handwriting notes and feedback. We'd mail it back. We'd have discussion meetings and ultimately select recipients. I'm sure things have transitioned quite a bit since then, but that was our first kind of introduction to these programs. We did then, however, go through kind of that interactive online transformation that occurred, which really meant, using our websites, putting on built-in web forms, a lot of downloading of documents, a lot of emailing back and forth, tons and tons and tons of spreadsheets. And to be honest with you, as a volunteer, it actually created more work for us because none of those tools are really intended for the task at hand. And then we started to see kind of the negative ramifications that came from it. So, kind of a couple things started to happen. As I'm sure you've all seen very much in your local community, it is a pretty close knit group. And so, with our recognition program, oftentimes the volunteers and the review committees knew who the applicants were. They had biases towards them. And so, with the inability to redact data, we actually saw firsthand review committees kind of making unfair selections. We also started to unfortunately see submissions get lost. So, either you'd have, built-in web forms or they'd send in an email with a bunch of attachments saying, here's my nomination packet, looking forward to the results. It would go to a spam filter. And so as a review committee, we actually would sit down, go through entire selections, right? And then find out months later that there were a handful of applicants that didn't get included, or we got their initial applications, but then they made changes to it or sent over updates or added a bunch of file uploads as attachments, and those kind of get lost. So that's kind of what led us to build Reviewers, an online platform to build these types of campaigns. So any type of application-based review program. So obviously for today's conversation, your member recognition awards, but also leadership programs, grants, scholarships, fellowships, and everything in between. As an online platform that really does serve kind of two main goals here. So goal number one is going to be obviously how do we streamline operations and create a significant amount of efficiency for you and your team. There's better things that you should be focusing on than spreadsheets. But number two is how do we elevate the experience, primarily for the applicants, the nominators, the board members, the volunteers, and everybody in between. So, with all that said, many of you actually may be already a little bit familiar with Reviewer or work with the Civics Bee. If your local chamber is participating in it, you might have already kind of quasi used Reviewer, as well as I work with quite a few other chambers for a wide variety of programs. In conversation with a chamber the other day, however, they were kind of walking you through kind of what their goals were and how they wanted to recognize and honor their members in multiple different ways. And they asked us if we had any kind of current chambers that were doing that. And the first name that came to mind was the city of the Austin Chamber of Commerce. who does a program called the A List. Very specifically, they do a couple different awards, but that one, it's targeting startup companies and emerging companies to attract and retain talent in obviously Austin, Texas. But I think overall, it's a really well-structured program, and there's a ton of takeaways of how we can translate that to many, many other types of member recognition awards that are happening within your chamber. So that's what I wanted to talk through today. It's kind of like if you were to take that program and kind of quote unquote dumb it down to like the 4 or 5 key components, what does that look like, and how can you translate that to your programs? Obviously, there's a significant number of benefits of offering recognition awards to your audience and to your membership, right? We're always looking for one-to-one communication with them. We want to celebrate them. We want to recognize them. We want them to feel honored. We also want to find a way to attract and retain kind of a younger demographic of member, right? That will kind of get them on early in their life cycle, get them engaged into other kind of programs that you might be offering. It could be leadership development programs, and obviously keep them as a member for many, many years. So the award programs are kind of a really good feeder to those types of programs. So with all that said and done, like what does a kind of a common recognition program look like? And then what are some of the best practices that go along with it? So the first thing I want to talk about today is how you structure the nomination workflow. 'Cause I think traditionally speaking, most of these award programs are kind of going about it the wrong way. They have like an open call for nominations on their website, and they are probably using some type of generalized built-in web form. You might be using like Chamber Master or some of these databases for your chamber. They're incredible tools. Don't change a thing. But their built-in web forms are just that. They're just online forms. And so what happens is that people go there, they fill out a nomination, and then you're left having to download, export, recompile, do all sorts of things with it. The challenge, however, though, is that nominations are quite high level. I don't believe it equips you and your team for success. It doesn't give you the data that you need to conduct a review to honor the most deserving members. One of the other challenges, too, is that, for example, I love my wife to death, but if I was to submit a nomination about her, it wouldn't be as good of a nomination as if she was to submit one for me, right? She's going to put forth more time and energy. She's a significantly better writer than I am. So is it a fair representation of the nominee? Probably not. It's more so a reflection of both the effort, energy, and the talents of the nominator. So the way like we like to think about running a award nomination structure is to actually break the process into two completely parallel, independent workflows. Number one would be an open call for nominations, which I'll show you this. I'm not going to get too deep right now into like what to collect. I am going to show that to you. But the goal of the open call for nominations, number one, is marketing, right? We want to get the word out there. We want to engage with not even our membership, but just our community. So who are you? Who are you nominating and why, right? Build up this giant portfolio and this pool of potential nominees. From there, we actually want the nominees to be treated almost like the Oscars or the Emmys, where they quote unquote accept their nomination, and then they would then join the process. And so, if you're collecting things like resumes or any personal details about them, it should come from them to begin with, anyways, right? It's going to be more accurate. It should just come from the source. So instead of kind of beating around the bush, why don't we just ask them directly to submit it? So the nominees themselves are the ones who are doing the bulk of the nomination. They're doing their file uploads, all that kind of fun stuff. We do love references here at Review, which I'll get into here in a little bit. And so the idea though is that when you go to do a review and selection process, you use nominations to get the volume, and then you take the nominees, and that's actually what you're physically reviewing. That way you're comparing apples to apples. And so again, what does that actually look like? I am going to show you here the Austin A list. Again, this award very specifically is targeting kind of young and emerging startup companies as a way to attract and or retain talent in the area. Love it. I think it's a really, really well run program. But the general kind of concept around there could be applied to literally any type of award program, any type of leadership application, whatever it might be. So with all that said, I am also going to talk a little bit about references, and I'm going to kind of preview it now, but then I'm going to show this to you. So references are an incredible way to get a third-party insight on the nominees. What I mean by that is you are collecting open call for nominations. You got the data coming from the nominees, but a lot of our clients and a lot of these programs, they want kind of another third-party individual to offer insights about the nominee. It's also super powerful with leadership programs. The challenge, though, is that nobody wants to sit down and read an entire letter. On top of that, nobody actually wants to write the letter to begin with either. And so it's kind of an old school traditional model. So instead, what we love to see happen at Reviewer is lower the barrier. So allow the nominee and or the nominator to put in like who the reference will be, trigger a notification to go to them. And then instead of sitting down from scratch and writing a full blown letter, which is going to have the same challenges as the nomination process I mentioned, right? It's going to be more of a reflection of the writing capability of the reference. Instead, ask them to rank the nominee on certain characteristics that align with your chamber's mission and vision, or like what are 2 to 3 essay prompts that you want that reference to talk about. That way, you're kind of guiding them through the process. You're lowering the barrier, and then again, it's like apples to apples. So when your review team sits down to go and conduct a selection, and they go to read through those references, every single nominee has kind of the same data points associated with them for consistency purposes. So I wanted to jump the gun to talk about that just so I can also preview it here at one time. So let's jump into here, reviewer, just a little bit. Let's go ahead and switch my window over. And you're going to see the Austin A list. So, generally speaking, like we would prefer to work alongside your website. And again, the goal here isn't necessarily to preview reviewer, although we totally are going to. The idea is to kind of showcase like visually what do these workflows look like in a platform such as Reviewer, that way you can apply it to yours. Obviously, if you're looking to utilize a tool like Reviewer, I'd love to chat more. If you're just informational speaking, we also love to consult the kind of audit programs as well. But the general consensus here is that we'll leverage your website. So dates, deadlines, criteria, all the marketing goes through your hub anyways, right? Like let's leverage your brand and your presence. From there, you're going to have a link that says, click here to submit a nomination. And then that link will actually send people to what I call the nomination structure. So there's kind of two components that are happening here. I'm going to introduce a concept in a little bit called profiles, which are an incredibly powerful component because if you think through like what a typical award structure looks like, there's a ton of moving pieces. You've got nominators and then the nominees. Sometimes you've got multiple nominators about the same nominee, right? Like 10 different people might nominate XYZ company for an award. You have their file uploads, their deliverables, their short answers. There's going to be a review and selection process. There's communication that goes on. So, how do you take all those moving pieces and all those elements and centralize them? And we do that through a concept called profiles. Now, what I would say, and as you can kind of see here, we don't necessarily want the nominator to create a profile. We want to lower the barrier for them. So, many times, the nominator, again, the goal is to keep it short, simple, sweet. The goal of the nomination is A, to increase volume and boost participation, and then B, get this into the hands of the nominees themselves. So nominator comes in and they put in who they are. They're then going to put in who they're nominating. And then at a high level, like why are they a deserving nominee for this year's whatever the award is? You might offer multiple different award programs. So you might actually ask them like from a drop down or from like a checkbox, like, hey, what award category are they most deserving for? Those can trigger additional follow-up sequences. So there's a lot of power behind the scenes at Reviewer. But the general goal again is nominator comes in, they submit who they're nominating. We want to lower the barrier. So if you do want them to submit multiple nominations, they can. And then what happens is that in real time, our system, or most tools, I think hopefully should, trigger a notification to the nominee that would say, hey, Kyle, you've been nominated for this year's, A-list awards. Click here to accept your nomination and formally fill out your application. So they would then click on the link, and then that would bring them directly into the nomination form. So again, you have one kind of overarching nomination packet broken down into two very dedicated components. So I now, as the submitter or as the nominee, and again, this is a company award for startups, but it could be individual awards, it could be leadership development. There's a ton of use cases. So the nominee then comes in, they're presented with some type of welcome message outlining next steps, and then they get into the bulk of the nominations form. So in this example, it's actually targeting two different demographics of nominees. So I mentioned earlier on, if I choose investor versus company, I might completely see different questions on the back end. We're going to categorize them for you. You can have different selection criteria, different dates and deadlines. But the goal here, on top of making the nominee put effort into filling out the form, is to lower the barrier for them. So they have to be able to save, they can log out, they can come back later. Selfishly, it gives you some really cool tracking mechanisms. So for any of the marketers on the call today, we actually just introduced multiple different conversion opportunities. So conversion opportunity number one is how many nominators have started but haven't finished, so you can send them reminders. Number two is how many nominees were nominated but haven't yet begun. and then how many nominators nominated somebody, the nominee started, but then they haven't finished, and then send them built-in reminders as well. So there's a huge pipeline of conversion that you can start to track. And obviously, we have the tools in place to help you kind of usher people along. But the goal here is the nominee will then kind of come in and they're going to answer a series of questions about themselves. So this would be like, who is my company? What's my address? I can upload some file uploads. Files kind of are the bread and butter of reviewer. I will show this to you, but every deliverable gets embedded. So whenever you and your team go to conduct a review, you can actually physically look at a photo, watch a video, read a PowerPoint, look at a spreadsheet, all in our system while side by side, leaving comments and notes, etc. Then it kind of jumps into like the bulk of the application. Now, again, because this is targeting startup companies, it's almost like a pitch competition. So for those of you that watch like Shark Tank on ABC, very similar style. So it's going to ask the applicant about, like what problem are you trying to solve? If you've raised funds or not, like why are you a good fit for the Austin ecosystem? Where's your current office located at, and like what value are you going to provide to our community? Things like that. The next thing I want to kind of get into though is references. Now, going back just one step, that entire nomination form itself is completely configurable. So for those of you that have like existing award structures, like we wouldn't be obviously mimicking this. You would just kind of plug in whatever your own nomination forms are. Kind of a plot twist to this is that Reviewer works with give or take 1,000 of these programs, not just with chambers, but also membership-based associations, nonprofits, academia. We have like a million different styles of awards in our platform. So if you are looking for like kind of canned workflows and questions, we have that as well. This is obviously a very, very niche type of award. But again, applicants will answer these questions, fill out a series of questions. Getting into the references. So I mentioned earlier on the trigger system. So I think this is one of the coolest features of Reviewer. And I think, again, a way to kind of engage your community is the applicant would put in like the name and email of who is writing a reference on their behalf. And then again, it'll trigger an email notification. So in this case, Frederick will get an email saying, hey, Frederick, Kyle's asked that you write a reference on his behalf for this year's Austin A-list or for this year's, emerging leader program. Click here to submit it. And then when Frederick clicks on that link, he is brought into a page like this. So Frederick can answer a series of questions. Frederick could fill out a score sheet. He could answer, upload a letter. So again, this is kind of that templated version where we're kind of guiding the reference through something versus saying, hey, now go write a letter from scratch. The reason why I love this is number one is it helps kind of create a compelling story about the nominee. It helps differentiate one nominee from somebody else. But number two is this is super cool marketing collateral, right? Like you're able to take the nomination, the references, and basically honor and celebrate your membership with these kind of really great things that people are saying about them. So again, with Reviewer, the goal is to kind of lower the barrier so everything gets kind of compiled. So as soon as this reference gets submitted, it'll get automatically attached back to the applicant's profile. So if anybody has any questions or comments, by all means, toss them in there. The next thing I want to kind of talk about, though, is great. We've collected all these nominations. And again, historically speaking, like this is being done. Most of you are already running these types of award programs. The thing we're trying to avoid is having kind of a bunch of tools in place that are being kind of hacked together and used versus, using a dedicated platform, right? Downloading of spreadsheets and emails and recompiling. We just have to kind of get that out of our daily lives. It's almost 2025. And I guess as much as that we want to kind of ideally streamline operations, equally, if not more important, is like, what does that experience look like for your membership, for your community, for your volunteers? They're looking for interactive tools and more so than just like spreadsheets. So with all that said, we've collected all these award nominations. I'm not going to get too deep into like the admin side of Reviewer today. With that said, at some point in time, though, you need to review those nominations and obviously pick award recipients. And that's, I think, really where the bread and butter of not just Reviewer comes into play, but also probably the most important characteristics to these programs. Because at the end of the day, we got to do two things. One is we have to build community confidence, right? That it was a fair, non-biased review and selection process. And number two is that we're going to ask a team of people to come in and read these nominations. And you physically can't ask them to look at 100 nominations. I think our data and our science shows that roughly 15 or so is their threshold. And I know that number seems quite low, but it's very, very true. So a lot of times, these review processes might be broken into multiple phases of review. You could do it by multiple categories. I'll kind of walk through some of the common workflows. But if you think through, if you're a volunteer and you're asked to read through these nomination packets, you're probably going to be doing it on a Wednesday once you put your kids to sleep, right, on off hours. And so after 15, like their energy levels dramatically fall. And what ends up happening is that anybody after that is not going to get the fair energy that from the applicant's perspective that they deserve. And so for you, I think the first question to ask ourselves is, okay, once the nominations come in, like how do we want to pair that up with a team for review? And I would think about that from two different perspectives. Number one is, are there themes that we can identify to categorize our submissions? So if you are one of those awards that has multiple award categories, that's kind of the easy way of doing it, because what you can actually do is have a dedicated team or pod in charge of each individual category, right? So almost like you have a committee in charge of different sections. Another way of thinking through things might be like multiple phases of review. So nominations come in, and there's a dedicated team in charge of vetting them. So thumbs up, thumbs down, high level ranking tools. And this is, excuse me, actually what the Austin A-list does. They actually will vet people, do a review, they narrow it down. I think like the top 85, or they narrow the numbers down. A different team will come in, they'll do a secondary review, and then it goes to a final board review and selection process. And so again, you're basically taking large groups of nominations and then kind of breaking them into more bite-sized pieces with dedicated teams. You could also use the two of those in conjunction with one another. The second thing I would look at, and if you're not already doing it, just survey your review committee and say, hey, you know what? Like, how many nominations are you comfortable reviewing? And then you can take the two of those together to create like a structure. So, one of the things I love to do at Reviewer is create random workflows. So, what I mean by that is you might bifurcate out your nominations into these buckets, but then you might say, you know what? I want to just make sure that each submission gets reviewed a certain number of times, right? So, if you apply to my award program, you're going to get reviewed exactly 5 times, no less, no more. At the same time, I'm also going to ensure that my review team doesn't look at more than 15 people. And then obviously, hopefully a tool like Reviewer, you'll be able to automatically do that for you. You can literally just type in those numbers, and then it'll take your nominations and then automatically distribute it out to your staff in a way that makes sense. The other thing I want to add to that is potentially incorporating like a public showcase and or voting. So it's kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? A polarizing conversation, because public voting can be very, very flawed, right? Like nothing prevents people from paying somebody on Fiverr or Upwork to cast 10,000 votes. There's protocols in place here at Reviewer to help you identify who the voters are. You can limit them to a certain number of votes. We can track their IP addresses. And it helps kind of create a bit more fairness around it. But the reason why I love public voting is two reasons. Number one is that you can take your award nominations and you can publicly showcase and turn off voting. So you're basically going to send this out to your community and say, hey, look, here's this year's top companies, or here's all of this year's nominations. Go learn more about them, right? These are businesses and members within your community. We want people to be aware of the great things that they're doing. If you are going to then do public voting, I would actually make it weighted. So I would have like a fan favorite. That way it's a completely separate category, and or make the overall score that they give a weighted average. Um, Another reason why I like that is because we can track who the voters are. You just got like a super great marketing list of all of the voters that you can then put into additional chamber marketing campaigns to engage them for other opportunities or campaigns that you're doing. So again, what do these two things look like? So bouncing back here into Reviewer, I'm going to jump over to our workflow tool. So as an operation team, you actually get these really cool dashboards, and you're able to kind of track in progress submissions, what are your dates and your deadlines. You can send out automations, all these kind of great things. You literally have a command center for the program. The thing I wanted to show you though is kind of two parts. So number one is I mentioned that concept called profiles earlier on. This is a way to visualize that. So again, as these nominations are coming in, you basically get a menu of all of your nominees, and you can sort and filter by your nominators, your nominees, all that kind of fun stuff, by category, by phase of review, whatever your filters look like. The goal here, though, is that you can then click on the name of the nominee, and then this is their virtual nomination packet. So I still love the very manual binder-based approach, right, where you've got like a nomination binder per person. I just hate the physical nature of binders. So the idea here is that we took that and then we just virtualized it. So I have Dunder Mifflin. This is one of our companies that was nominated. And you can see in the center of my page, I have all the information about them. This is what was collected within your nomination form. Off to the right, you can actually send them one-to-one direct communication. You can log internal notes about them with your team. So it's like a collaboration tool. I mentioned the file uploads. So if I jump up to my attachments, you might have photos, videos, pitch decks, PowerPoints, logos, company images, whatever it might be. The idea though is it'll show you a list of every file that was uploaded. And then if I press the view button, it actually embeds that file right in Reviewer. So for those of you that might be doing leadership programs, things like resumes, right? All those deliverables will show up right in your attachment section. And then the last thing I want to show you here is the what I call supplemental forms. So any nominations and or references will show up in this list. So if as Dunder Mifflin, got nominated 4 times, you might see 4 line items here, one per nomination that was submitted about me. And then also in this example, member Frederick, this is for Frederick's reference letter. If I press the view button next to these, it'll then show me directly on my profile the reference and or the nomination that was submitted about my behalf. So again, profiles are super powerful. It takes all the components and elements that we've collected and centralizes them into one hub. So again, thing I really want to show you now is creating these review workflows. So Reviewer has a concept called buckets. Again, this is exactly how the A-list does it. Again, they have a very, very, very niche award program. So they're categorizing their companies or their entries or their members based off of the stage of company that they're at. Again, if you are an award program that offers a 40 under 40, a new member of the year, or whatever those awards might be, you might have one bucket per award category. You might do that in conjunction with phase one, phase two, final selection. There's a million ways to set this up. The thing that I wanted to show you though is again, the concept of a bucket is quite powerful because what happens is you either fill up automatically or manually a bucket full of submissions. So in this bucket, we've got a bunch of companies. The next step is to assign that bucket to a committee. So whenever Cindy, Tony, Paul, and Mary come into Reviewer, they're only going to see the entries or the nominations in the bucket that they've been given access to. So it's a really, really great way for you to take large number of submissions and then pair them up with a dedicated team to review. Helps you control access level, data security, privacy, all those types of things. Better yet is if I open my bucket up, it's actually going to show me a list of all of my nominations. So in this example, I have 6. I have Teslux through Roomba. It'll also show me the current number of reviewers or volunteers that are assigned to review them and then who they are. So going back to my example earlier, I could literally say, let's just bulk select everybody and say, I want to make sure that each one gets reviewed no more than 6 times, but no less than 4. Or maybe you want to say, I want to give my review team no more than 15 submissions. You can literally type those numbers in and then equally and randomly reviewer will distribute submissions and or reviewers to one another to make the numbers match. If you want to get even further into the details, you could also override this or edit it. So it actually show you, for example, Mark here. Mark is one of my judges. Currently, Mark's in charge of reviewing Microsloth, Dunder Mifflin, Orange Ink, and Roomba. So you can actually unselect people's names and then reassign them back out to others. So you have one-to-one manual control. So really powerful stuff there. So the last piece to this puzzle is we collected nominations, we reviewed how to access them, we just assigned them out to our review team. The last step is how do you actually conduct a review? And I think there's 2 components that go into play here. So component number one, and I'm going to show you public voting here as well. Component number one is lowering the barrier to make it highly efficient for the review team to cast their votes or do their selections. Number two is how do you put in protocols that will ensure a fair, non-biased selection. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that our nominees and our applicants, and again, it can be scholarship, leadership programs, or awards, feel confident that when they were reviewed that they got the fair shake that they deserved. And you can do that a couple different ways. So again, this is going to be very program specific, but you may want to consider redacting any personal identifying information, right? So if it's a leadership program or a leadership award, don't show the person's name or their demographic details. Or if it has like proprietary information, just like don't show it. So that way the review team is only reviewing the merits of the form and the content, not who they are and their backgrounds, right? You also may want to consider obviously using score sheets. I love score sheets. At the end of the day, most of these programs will culminate with some type of deliberation, right? A team is going to sit down and they're going to hash it out and they're going to talk about why they feel certain people should be recipients. With that said, we can't have a completely subjective review. So by using score sheets, it does give us some data to back up those decisions and offer insights. It's also great too, because if you ever wanted to, you could share score sheets back to the nominees. So the way that I like to structure a score sheet is to keep it short and simple and sweet. The score sheet should run in parallel with your nomination form. So in this example, if one of the questions is like, what is this business's impact on the city of Austin? Tell us more about their leadership team. Each of those scorecard questions should match up with the form. So that way the review team can simply side by side go through them one at a time, answer them, and not have to kind of bounce around, skip around too much. The other best practice I want to offer here is going to be maybe not asking the review team to offer point numbers. So generally speaking, we think through scorecards, it's like, hey, give a point from 1 to 20 on this certain question. The problem is that most evaluators get really bogged down in numbers. Like, what's the difference between a 16 and a 17? And it just slows them down. What we have found to conduct the best review as well as the quickest review is to try to elicit a emotional response from your team. So when the review team comes in, maybe instead it says, from below average to great, rank this applicant on XYZ. So they just read the question and then they just subjectively kind of give them their emotional response. Now, behind the scenes, there are point values that correspond directly with those choices. So the review team, much like the nominators, much like the references, are just answering a series of questions based off of a prompt, and then the system will kick out results. So, with all that said and done, I want to showcase that. And then I also want to showcase kind of a little bonus item here, which is going to be if you do a random distribution, which basically means that every single applicant gets reviewed by different evaluators, it's going to mean that some applicants aren't going to be reviewed by the same people. So, what happens if you have some of your volunteers or some of your judges that, quite frankly, are just stricter than others, right? How do you not penalize or reward a nominee for being reviewed by somebody who, on average, is just more strict? So, how do you take care of that process? So jumping into review are kind of two things that we're going to look at. Number one is the back end judging. So your review team gets a menu, and that menu is a list, right, of all the companies or members you want them to review. If you are redacting data, obviously you can hide details from here as well. But again, the game name of the game is to lower the barrier for them. So they will simply click on the name or ID of the member or of the nominee, and then they get a split screen. So again, the left-hand side of the page is the nomination packet, and then the right-hand side is the selection tool. Like I mentioned beforehand, this selection tool is a 1 through 5. So again, I like to ask, emotional responses from, good to great. With that said, 1 through 5 is a low enough point value scale that this works really, really well. You'll also notice though, as I scroll through here, the questions match up. So the number one thing in here is revenue and funding. Boom, revenue and funding. The next section is going to be about the leadership of the company. Boom, leadership of company. So it allows the review team to kind of side by side read through the form, answer a series of questions. Now, if you want them to look at file uploads or references or nominations, this is where those tabs become super powerful because it allows the review team to actually kind of toggle back and forth. So they can physically look at file uploads, they can leave comments and notes, they can look at the references, they can look at the nominations while still side by side filling out their score sheet. Now, again, the system then will auto tabulate. So your team is never crunching numbers. There's no sharing spreadsheets back and forth. The review team just simply clicks submit, boom, they're done. And then you get this leaderboard. And that leaderboard will show you on a per bucket basis every single nominee, the committee or the team that reviewed them, how they individually reviewed, how they collectively reviewed, averages. And then from here, you can actually start to use this to power deliberation meetings or make decisions. So maybe this is your end all be all results, right? This is your highest rated applicant. This is your lowest rated. Maybe you want to take your top X and advance them to the next phase. Maybe this is a leadership program and your top 10 move on to an interview phase, right? You could take your top 10 and then boom, advance them to interview. So a lot of really powerful things that are happening here. The last thing I wanted to show you here before we look at public voting is Mark here, right? So this is problematic because I see that Mark scored Sheldon a 12. So the first question that I would be asking is, did Mark just score Sheldon really, really low? Or is Mark on average just a tough cookie? So what if Mark has never given higher than a 14? So while that's still quite low compared to other judges, it's still one of the best scores that Mark gave, yet Sheldon is absolutely being penalized for it. So this is a real example. Obviously, everything has been redacted. But what's happening here is we had a client of ours that said, look, why is it that every single year, any nominee that gets reviewed by this judge never receives an award? And it turns out because they always score low. So in reviewer, we'll actually show you a list of A, all of the nominees, and then B, every single judge and how they scored on a per question basis. What you really care about though is this green section. And what we're doing here is we're showing you every single one of your judges and what their personal averages are. So again, Judge Judy here on average scores about a 24, whereas Tony over here on average scores about a 34. That's a giant 10-point difference. So anybody that Judge Judy scores is always going to be kind of behind the eight ball compared to Tony. So what you really care about though is what happens. So now that we've identified this in the report, we actually changed the scores. So if you got scored a 23.875, that now becomes a 1. That means you were scored completely average. If you scored lower than 1, that means you were scored below that judge's average. If you score higher than 1, you were scored above that judge's average. Now what you can do is you can take each individual judge's averages and compare them to one another. So at the end of the day, instead of saying, hey, here's this year's award recipient with a score of a 44, it's, hey, this year's award recipient scored on average 1.15 times higher than the average, whereas the last place applicant scored, 2/10 of a point lower than average. So really powerful stuff here to help ensure a fair, non-biased review. The last thing I want to kind of preview for you is public voting. So this is a completely different example. This is actually an association of ours that does a award program for individuals. But why this is super cool is this is a public showcase page. So what they do is they take all of their, in this case, the top 50 award nominations, and they put them on this page. And they can send this out. So your community can go here and they can look at like the public profiles of your members. They can see some type of image or a thumbnail. They can see their name and then a high level abstract. From here, if you, and you can also share this through social media, you can publicize it. But from here, if you press the view button and read more, it shows you the public bio of that member or of that nominee. So again, use your thinking caps here. You might have a bunch of data you're collecting. You can pick and choose what shows up here. So off to the left is actually an image gallery. So if there was a video to actually play here, I can look at images. And then off to the right are details about that particular member. Now, if you are doing public voting, it would ask you to log in first. Again, super critical because now we can limit them to a certain number of votes. We also now know who they are. So you now have a giant marketing list. Once they log in to vote, they can then actually cast their vote. That could be a simple thumbs up, 1 through 5, 1 through 10. So again, two really kind of parallel use cases. One is just a public showcase of your incredible community. And then number two is actually allowing people to cast votes and partake in the award program. So with all that said and done, I threw a lot at you. There's so many moving parts and so many components to these programs. And again, our work with chambers is quite broad. I think our next one that we're going to host will be hopefully showcasing in a conjunction with the Grand Rapids Chamber. They use us for a lot of different use cases, specifically a leadership program. But yeah, there are so many moving parts that I think are what we love doing here at Reviewer is kind of two parts. So number one is obviously we have the platform and infrastructure to power these campaigns. But number two is that over a decade of experience, we've seen pretty much everything. And so if you ever want to kind of talk through or look at what you're doing, kind of how you currently operate, what your programs look like, and then just offer A, best practices or B, some emerging trends, we'd love to do things like that. So